The night they cut my bonus, I didn't cry. I poured myself a glass of Merlot, leaned back in my office chair, and stared at the city lights reflecting on my window. The skyline glimmered like a row of knives, sharp, distant, and uncaring. Below those towers were men who believed they had just humiliated me into silence. They had no idea what they'd just awakened. I had been the chief financial officer of Rydell Industries for 7 years, the kind of company where boardroom smiles were as fake as their quarterly forecasts. I'd carried them through 3 recessions, balanced the debt of reckless acquisitions, and even protected the CEO from an insider trading inquiry that could have ended his career. Every penny of their profit had my signature hidden somewhere in the numbers. And yet, when the time came to celebrate the year's success, they cut me out. The email came late, just after midnight. Executive compensation adjustments. A sterile title for something so personal. My bonus, once 7 figures, was replaced with a cost-saving adjustment clause. It wasn't about money. It was about control. The CEO, Mark Rydell, had grown insecure. My precision, my power over the books. It frightened him. So he decided to put me in my place. I still remember the board meeting that morning, the smell of fresh coffee, the artificial smiles, Mark's little smirk when he announced the necessary leadership alignment that conveniently benefited every man in the room except me. "We all make sacrifices," he said. My jaw didn't move. I simply nodded. That's when I realized something. They thought loyalty was weakness. They mistook calm for surrender. They didn't know me at all. That night, I replayed every file I'd ever signed, every report I'd ever doctored to make their greed look like growth. I'd built a kingdom of numbers for them. Now I could burn it down one formula at a time. But revenge wasn't going to be loud. It had to be silent, surgical, and irreversible. I wanted them to destroy themselves using the same system they had built to exploit me. I remember Mark's last words that day as he walked out of the boardroom. "Try not to take it personally, Claire. It's just business. Business." I whispered that word to myself for weeks after. It rolled around in my mind like poison. Sweet at first, then burning. What he didn't understand was that business was my weapon. I could move millions without lifting a finger. I could redirect an entire company's future by adjusting a single forecast, reclassifying an expense, or burying one asset under another. They thought cutting my bonus was a punishment. They had just handed me motive. From that night on, every meeting, every spreadsheet, every handshake became part of a quiet symphony of revenge. I began collecting every thread of their corruption: fake subsidiaries, shadow accounts, offshore transfers hidden under charity fronts. I had built the system. I knew exactly where the bodies were buried. And soon the same signatures they'd forced me to sign would become their undoing. I didn't rush. I didn't rage. I smiled at Mark during meetings, congratulated the board on their strategic direction, and played the perfect obedient executive. Meanwhile, every keystroke, every line item, was a seed planted in their future collapse. And when the numbers began to whisper back at me, the inconsistencies, the forged audits, the missing trust funds, I knew my time was coming. They had cut my bonus. Now, I would cut their empire. They taught me to read a balance sheet the way some people read a love letter. Each line held intent, motive, and truth. In the weeks after the bonus cut, I lived inside those margins. I arrived before dawn, lights on, coffee cold at my desk. I stayed long after the cleaners locked the lobby, my reflection a pale ghost in the glass. Outwardly, I kept the same rhythm. Crisp reports, measured replies, the soft laugh that made Mark think he still controlled me. Inside, I was cataloging everything. First came the small things that felt harmless: a misclassified consulting fee here, an oddly timed vendor payment there, a charity donation that reappeared as operational expense. Little blips that executives dismiss as noise. But noise turns into music if you know the score. I began building a map. A ledger of misplaced transactions, shell entities, and dormant accounts that woke up when they wanted to hide a transfer. Each anomaly was a breadcrumb. Each breadcrumb led me deeper. I reopened folders I had thought were closed. Old audit memos, whispered emails between finance and legal, a spreadsheet with a mysterious column labeled projective smoothing. When I dug, I found the signatures I expected, executives who loved plausible deniability. A handful of junior accountants had been shuffled around like chess pawns. One of them, a quiet analyst named Priya, had been reassigned the week an off-the-books transfer occurred. Priya was expendable to them. She became indispensable to me. I didn't confront anyone. That would have been theater. Instead, I recruited allies without revealing my aim. I trained Priya to pull raw journal entries from the ERP at odd hours, then taught her how to anonymize them so they wouldn't show up in routine cross-checks. I found a compliance officer who stayed late and loved puzzles. He thought we were doing deep-dive reconciliations. He didn't ask questions. People who love their jobs rarely do. They just want problems solved. At home, I built a parallel spreadsheet, one I kept encrypted and hidden behind layers of innocuous files. On paper, I remained the dutiful CFO. Tight budgets, conservative forecasts, and cheerful town hall speeches. In the encrypted ledger, I created threads that only I and my small team could see. The off-ledger payments, the offshore nodes, the names tied to mailboxes in places I would never have believed. I labeled everything with dates, emails, and the quiet code names I borrowed from spy novels, because language gives order to chaos. Still, revenge needs more than evidence. It needs timing. Exposing a scandal too early would spark a cleanup and erase the traces. So I set traps. I allowed a handful of small wins to go to Mark, a public win he could wear like armor, so he would relax, confident in his immunity. Meanwhile, I engineered reporting delays that forced certain reconciliations to hit at the end of quarter cycles when attention was thin and bonuses were being whispered about. Stress reveals mistakes. Mistakes reveal intent. I also rehearsed how I would look when the curtain came down. I practiced my neutral face in the mirror, the voice that would read the facts without venom. I knew the world loved a calm witness more than an enraged accuser. So I smiled at shareholders, toasted the right people at events, and let Mark believe his little cuts had made me small. The truth is, he made me surgical. What I could not prepare for were the small, human things that crept in. Late-night confessions from Priya about sleeplessness, the way she cried once into her hands because she feared losing the life she'd built to keep her family afloat, or when the compliance officer hesitated, suddenly afraid of consequences he had never imagined. Revenge has collateral. I promised them protection. Quiet assurances that we would be careful. I meant it. Carefully was the only way I wanted this done. Every morning the city woke unaware, and every night I threaded the trail a little further. There were moments I almost slipped, an email missent, a ledger misnamed, but each near miss taught me restraint. I learned to wait like a tide. The board had taken my bonus to remind me of my place. I had taken my place in the machinery of the company, and turned it into an instrument. They had no idea the woman they'd humiliated was cataloging their sins in antiseptic rows. They only saw the calm. That calm was deliberate. That calm would be the prelude to everything that followed. The first crack appeared during an otherwise ordinary quarterly meeting. Mark stood at the head of the table, charming as ever, pitching an aggressive expansion strategy that looked dazzling on slides but rotten beneath the surface. The projections were inflated. I knew it the moment I saw them. They were using falsified revenue recognition entries to paint a story of unstoppable growth. As CFO, I was expected to nod along. I did. My pen tapped rhythmically against my notepad, while my mind mapped every lie being spoken aloud. Numbers don't lie, but people do. And when enough of them lie together, it becomes policy. That day, I realized the rot went deeper than I imagined. The company wasn't just greedy, it was diseased. They weren't content with manipulating forecasts. They were laundering profits through shell nonprofits, routing millions through education initiatives that existed only on paper. I'd stumbled into a machine of deception so polished it looked legitimate. And now, I was its face. My name, my signature, my liability. One evening, while reviewing bank confirmations, I found a transfer routed through a Cayman account linked to a consulting firm we'd supposedly dissolved 2 years ago. The authorization code? Mine. My exact signature, copied and pasted from an old document. They had forged me. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. This was no longer about money or ego. It was survival. If any of this surfaced, I'd be the scapegoat. They'd blame the overpaid CFO who went rogue with the company's finances. The woman who wanted more power than she deserved. I could already hear Mark's voice rehearsing his innocence. That night, I sat in my apartment, city lights flickering through the blinds, laptop glowing like a confession booth. I had to choose. Walk away and let them bury me, or fight back knowing it might destroy me too. The decision wasn't hard. I had nothing left to lose, so I changed my strategy. No more quiet collecting. I began recording. Every meeting, every call, every casual remark. I mirrored their servers under a secure offline drive. Each piece of evidence had to be airtight. No emotion, no assumptions, only proof. But proof comes with risk. Mark started noticing small inconsistencies. "Claire," he said one morning, leaning against my doorway with that condescending half-smile. "You've been distracted lately. Everything okay?" I smiled back, just focused on the numbers. He nodded slowly, suspicious, his eyes narrowing just enough for me to know he didn't believe a word. The tension between us became electric, a silent duel played across spreadsheets and board memos. Every interaction was loaded. Every compliment was a threat. Then came the audit. A random external review scheduled by the board. But I knew Mark was behind it. His attempt to smoke me out, to make me panic and reveal whatever I was hiding. He underestimated how calm I could be under fire. The auditors found nothing, because I gave them nothing. What they didn't know was that I had already prepared an alternate version of the books. Clean and flawless, waiting for their eyes. By the end of that week, I understood something fundamental. This was no longer about revenge. It was war. They had drawn first blood by erasing my worth. Now they were trying to erase my existence. But wars are not won by strength. They're won by precision, patience, and timing. And I had all three. They thought they were auditing me. In truth, I was auditing them, one secret at a time. It was Priya who first sensed something was off. She came to me one evening after everyone had left, her voice trembling as she said, "Mark asked me about the offshore transfers. The ones you told me never to mention." My heart froze. I had been careful, paranoid even, but somehow information had leaked. I looked at her, trying to read whether she was warning me or confessing. Her eyes darted away too quickly. That was my first clue. Over the following week, things began to change in subtle ways. My calendar suddenly filled with unrequested meetings. IT sent routine security checks on my workstation. My access to a few sensitive databases was quietly revoked. All small administrative details, but to me they felt like tripwires being set. Someone had told them I was digging. At first I suspected the compliance officer. He'd always been nervous, too eager to please. But when I confronted him indirectly, just a harmless comment about Mark's unusual accounting preferences, he looked genuinely puzzled. That left one possibility. Priya. I didn't want to believe it. She'd been loyal, even afraid of the system we were up against. But fear makes people unpredictable. I should have known that sooner. 3 nights later, while combing through the internal logs, I found it. A copied folder of my encrypted evidence files accessed from her user ID. Timestamped at 2:13 a.m. She'd sent them to an external drive. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the digital footprints, every click like a betrayal echoing through my screen. I waited for her the next morning. She walked into my office like nothing had happened, clutching her coffee, nervous but pretending calm. "Rough night?" I asked gently. She froze. The color drained from her face. She didn't need to answer. I saw it all. She'd been promised protection, maybe even a promotion, in exchange for giving Mark what he wanted. She had no idea that the files she copied were only partial, doctored versions I'd created as bait. I wanted to be angry. But looking at her shaking hands, I just felt tired. Betrayal didn't sting the way I thought it would. It burned quietly, like realization setting in. They'd turned her against me, the same way they'd tried to turn me against myself. Later that day, Mark called me into his office. The blinds were half closed, slicing the sunlight into cold bars across the room. He gestured for me to sit. "Claire," he began, "we've received some troubling information. It seems you've been..." keeping secondary records. Care to explain? There it was. The ambush. I held his gaze and smiled slightly. Secondary records? That sounds like something a responsible CFO would do, especially given how often data gets misplaced around here. His smirk faltered. Let's not play games. You've been under stress. I get it. Maybe you've taken things personally since the bonus adjustments. But this looks like retaliation. He leaned forward, voice dripping with mock concern. If you just hand over what you found, we can make this right. Quietly. No damage to your name. The audacity almost made me laugh. He thought this was negotiation. He thought he still had control. So I stood, straightened my jacket, and said calmly, Mark, I've always believed in transparency. Maybe it's time everyone else does too. He didn't answer. His eyes hardened. I knew then I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That evening, my company laptop locked me out. My corporate email went dark. Security escorted me out under the guise of a temporary suspension for review. I didn't fight it. I walked past the glass offices, the whispers, the pitying looks. They thought I was finished. But what they didn't know was that the real evidence, the unedited, encrypted truth, wasn't in their hands. It was safe, stored offline, tied to a timed release I'd set weeks ago. Priya's betrayal had changed the timeline, yes, but it hadn't destroyed my plan. It had accelerated it. As the elevator doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of Mark standing by his office window, watching me leave like a man convinced he'd won. He had no idea that the clock was already ticking. They'd taken my job. They'd taken my trust. Now, I was going to take everything else. When they escorted me out, they thought they'd severed my access. They had only cut the visible thread. Everything that mattered was already woven into places they wouldn't think to look. Step 1 was redundancy. I had copies of every incriminating ledger stored in 3 separate formats. An encrypted hard drive hidden in a safety deposit box under an assumed name. A secure cloud vault pre-authorized to release to a handful of outside parties if my personal key wasn't used within 48 hours. And a dead man's switch. A timed email that would send an unhackable package to a journalist I trusted if I didn't check in. I'd spent months cultivating that trust. Quiet lunches with an investigative reporter who loved corporate tales and hated injustice. He thought he was collecting an exclusive. He had no idea how tidy I'd made it for him. Step 2 was narrative control. Evidence without context can look like scandal. Evidence with context becomes indictment. I prepared a dossier, not just numbers but timelines, signed authorizations, email threads, and a forensic trail showing who benefited from each transfer. I annotated it with short, clinical notes. Authorized by, beneficiary, legal risk. I stripped the drama from it so the facts could speak in a voice the courts and the press could not ignore. Step 3 was pressure points. I knew which shareholders were fragile and which directors would panic if their stock dipped. I planted subtle market signals that would force the board into the open. Small disclosures, released in the right order, would create questions that demanded answers. I timed a string of reconciliations to appear only after market close, when a small ripple could become a tidal wave by morning. Timing again was everything. Step 4 was allies, legal and human. I hired, with money routed through unremarkable channels, a boutique law firm that specialized in whistleblower protections. They were expensive, discreet, and effective. I also reached out to Priya not to punish her, but to offer a chance to redeem what she'd done. Betrayal had cost us both. Redemption could turn a weapon into a shield. She was fragile, apologetic, and terrified, perfect for the role she would play when truth needed a human voice. I trained her to answer only certain questions, to say only what would corroborate the ledger without exposing herself or us to additional risk. Step 5, the trap. I allowed Mark to breathe. I fed him a series of small confirmations that made him believe his paper trail was secure. I leaked a doctored internal memo suggesting that auditors were satisfied and that the offshore accounts had been sunset. He relaxed. Confident executives are careless executives. Confident executives sign things. Then I engineered the exact signature I needed. In a moment of triumph, Mark authorized a transfer to a consulting vehicle that, on paper, looked routine. The vehicle's paperwork, forged to include a clause that triggered public disclosure under a specific accounting standard, was the key. When that clause was processed in the quarterly filing, I'd arranged to be delayed until his complacency. It would become a statutory requirement to disclose. That single bureaucratic line would blow open every previously hidden conduit. Step 6. The release. The hard drive, the cloud vault, the timed email, they all had staggered release schedules. The journalist would receive a portion designed to prompt investigation. The law firm would receive the full dossier with instructions to file protected complaints with regulators. The cloud vault would, at the precise moment the SEC equivalent filing appeared, push corroborating documents to a repository for forensic accountants. The market would see the disclosure, the press would follow, and the board would scramble. And the finale, not violent, but irreversible. I had structured the evidence so that their defense required admissions that could not be made without creating additional public records. Every attempt to explain away one irregularity generated proof of another. It was legal geometry. Trap the mind in a shape that leaves no escape. Before I left the building for good that night, I walked past the trading floor and looked down at the rows of glowing terminals. I pictured the dominoes falling. A press headline, lawyers firing off letters, regulators opening files, Mark's phone lighting up with frantic messages that would never be answered. I pictured the boardroom emptied of its smugness. I didn't expect mercy. I expected precision. There is a cruelty to corporate law. It moves slowly, bureaucratically, but relentlessly. I set its cogs in motion and then stepped back. Now I had to wait until the system did its work, the filings, the disclosures, the inevitable audits. My plan depended on institutions behaving predictably, on rules being followed even by those who had learned to bend them. I went home that night not as a defeated executive, but as the architect of an unfolding verdict. I slept like someone who had placed a delicate device and set the timer. When the first notification arrived on my burner phone, I smiled. The trap had sprung, and the sound it made was not fireworks. It was the quiet ring of an inevitable phone call. They had taken my bonus. Now the markets would take everything else. It started quietly, just a ripple across the stock ticker. 1 percentage point down by mid-morning, then 3 by noon. No headlines yet, just whispers in chat rooms and investor threads. By evening, the whispers had grown teeth. A financial blog published a small piece titled, "Questions Surrounding Rydell's Accounting Transparency." It was only a few paragraphs long, but the tone was deadly. Curious, accusatory, too specific to ignore. By the next day, every major outlet had picked it up. The journalist I'd primed months ago had received his package exactly on schedule. The evidence he released wasn't everything, just enough to suggest something big was coming. Enough to make regulators turn their heads, enough to make Mark sweat. When the first call came, I didn't answer. I wanted him to feel the silence before the storm. Then came another, from one of the directors, then a third from a blocked number. They all went to voicemail. My phone buzzed like a warning light, while I watched the news ticker scroll across the bottom of the TV. Rydell Industries under investigation for accounting irregularities. 3 days later, the market froze their trading. Shareholders demanded an emergency meeting. The board panicked, of course. They released a statement denying any wrongdoing, which only made the regulators hungrier. Within hours, subpoenas went out, to legal, to compliance, and finally, to finance. That's when Mark realized it wasn't coincidence. It was orchestration. He called me again, this time from a private number. "Claire," he said, voice tight, "you've made your point. Tell me what you want." I let the silence breathe before answering. "You already gave me what I wanted." He didn't understand. He never did. I didn't want his money, or his apology, or even my title back. I wanted truth, and I wanted it to hurt. The next morning, a leaked document surfaced online, my dossier. The version annotated in my own handwriting, stamped, signed, time-stamped. It detailed every fraudulent subsidiary, every unauthorized transaction, every hidden profit transfer. And most damning of all, it showed Mark's forged authorization under my name, his attempt to frame me. The story exploded. Television anchors debated it. Legal experts speculated. and by the weekend, the board voted to suspend Mark pending investigation. The same men who had clapped for him now turned their backs to save themselves. But revenge isn't clean. It never is. Priya called me late that night, crying. The investigators had reached out to her. She'd been summoned to testify. I assured her she'd be fine, that I'd built safeguards to protect her. Still, her voice shook as she whispered, "Claire, they're saying you leaked everything, that you planned this for months." She wasn't wrong. When I hung up, I looked around my apartment. The half-packed boxes, the fading glow of city lights through the rain. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like justice in slow motion, dragging its feet through the mud of greed and pride. By Monday, the CEO's resignation hit the news. His lawyer called it a personal decision. The board followed, one by one, like dominoes falling in silence. Their empire crumbled from the top down. The company's valuation dropped 40% in a week. Investigations expanded across borders. And me? I stayed still. No public statements, no interviews. Just the quiet satisfaction of watching their machine collapse under its own weight. Justice, I learned, doesn't roar. It whispers. And when it whispers long enough, it drowns out everything else. When the board meeting ended, silence hung in the air. No one clapped. No one congratulated anyone. It was the kind of quiet that only followed destruction. Elegant, precise destruction. Eleanor sat frozen, her hands trembling over the table while the CEO, her once ally, her secret lover, stared at the exposed documents on the screen. His reputation was done. The woman he thought he controlled had just dismantled his empire with a smile. I stood up slowly, gathering my papers, feeling the weight lift off my chest. "I'll expect your resignation by noon," I said softly. Not a threat, just a fact. He didn't speak. He just looked at me. That same confident man now hollow, realizing the empire he built on deceit had collapsed because of the one woman he underestimated. The board voted within minutes. Eleanor and the CEO were both removed effective immediately, and just like that, the company was free of the rot that had quietly poisoned it for years. When I walked out of that glass tower, the sky felt different. Lighter. The city hummed like it was breathing with me. I had thought revenge would feel violent, chaotic, but instead it felt peaceful. Weeks later, my name was engraved on the new leadership plaque, Interim Managing Director. It wasn't just a promotion, it was justice. And as I walked into my new office, I saw the same skyline where this story began. The same skyline I once stared at, heartbroken and furious. Now, it looked like possibility. I didn't smile. Not yet. Because revenge doesn't always end with celebration. Sometimes it ends with understanding. That power only means something when you use it to restore balance. And that's what I intended to do. They thought cutting my bonus would break me. Instead, it taught me patience, precision, and the quiet power of truth. Revenge isn't about rage. It's about timing, strategy, and understanding the weaknesses others ignore. In the end, it wasn't anger that won, but clarity. Every signature, every ledger, every hidden detail became a weapon, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because justice demanded it. I didn't seek recognition, only the restoration of balance. Power is not in fear or money or titles. It's in knowledge, patience, and the courage to act when the moment is right. They lost their empire. I gained freedom, reputation, and the certainty that those who underestimate you always pay the highest price. This is revenge untold. Where every secret finds its reckoning, don't forget to subscribe.